Was Lincoln's assassination written in prophecy long before it happened?
Shadow Archive.
The White House in 1865 was not yet the gleaming symbol of national pride it would become. Its walls creaked with age, its halls dimly lit by gaslight. During the final months of the Civil War, the atmosphere inside was heavy, thick with tension, exhaustion, and something harder to name. The man who occupied its upper chambers had aged 2 decades and 4 years. And yet, on certain nights, Abraham Lincoln would speak not of politics or war, but of dreams. Ward Hill Lamon remembered those nights too well. He was more than a bodyguard. He was Lincoln's confidant, his occasional envoy, and the only man the president allowed to carry a loaded pistol near him. Tall, boisterous, a former frontier lawyer like Lincoln himself, Lamon had an instinct for danger and a skeptic's heart. Yet even he couldn't forget the tone in Lincoln's voice one early morning in March, when the president had summoned him after a restless night. "I saw myself in the East Room," Lincoln said, "laid out. A corpse." Lamon had laughed nervously. Lincoln hadn't. The East Room was the largest chamber in the White House, a place reserved for formal receptions and state funerals. The dream had come uninvited, vivid, recurring. A silent procession, a covered casket, mourning figures dressed in black. And Lincoln's own face glimpsed through the veil of death. The war was nearly won. Lee's forces were crumbling, yet as victory approached, Lincoln seemed to drift further from the present. He spoke more often of fate, of unfinished work, of the end. Lamon grew concerned. He tightened security, slept lightly, and shadowed the president more closely than ever. But there was a problem. Lincoln had grown weary of protection. He rejected guards, brushed off warnings, and sometimes slipped out for carriage rides with little notice. His fatalism had deepened, and Lamon knew what that meant. The dream was not just a dream. There had been signs before, bizarre ones. Just months earlier, Lincoln had seen a double reflection of himself in a mirror, one ghostly pale, the other alive. He told Mary, who became hysterical. "It means you will be elected again," she said, "but die before the end of your second term." The president tried to laugh it off, but the image lingered in his mind. In Lamon's private papers, sealed for decades, he later revealed something strange. That same week, while on a brief trip away, he too had a vision. A vague impression of the president falling, blood on his collar. He told no one, not even Lincoln. It was the silence between two men who feared the same shadow. Then came April 14th. The war was over. Richmond had fallen. The streets of Washington rang with bells and cannon fire. People danced in Lafayette Square. Lincoln, smiling for the first time in weeks, made plans to see a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater. Lamon was away, sent to Richmond on official business. He didn't want to go. He protested the timing. He told Lincoln to stay home, or at least take full protection. The president waved him off. "You worry too much, Hill," Lincoln said. That was the last time they spoke. That night, John Wilkes Booth slipped into the president's box, aimed his Derringer pistol, and fired a single round into the back of Lincoln's head. As chaos erupted in the theater, Lamon was hundreds of miles away, awake, pacing. He did not yet know what had happened, but he felt it. The dream had come true. And the body was taken to the East Room. Just as Lincoln had seen it. Dawn broke with a silent, eerie calm over Washington on April 15, 1865. The bells that had celebrated peace only days earlier now tolled with a hollow sorrow. The flag atop the War Department lowered to half-mast. Men removed their hats in silence. Women wept openly on the street. Inside the White House, the East Room had been transformed into a shrine. Tall candles lined the walls. Heavy drapes cloaked the windows, muffling the morning light. A black catafalque stood in the center, its velvet cover hiding the full length of the pine casket beneath. Lamon returned to Washington in a fury, arriving before noon. He didn't need to ask where the body was. He pushed through a sea of stunned officials and journalists and entered the East Room alone. There it was. Just as Lincoln had described. The president's face was waxen, the beard neatly combed, the features composed by the surgeons as best they could. Yet the wound behind the ear remained, a hidden mark of finality. Lamon stood frozen, not out of shock, but of confirmation. He had feared this exact moment for weeks, if not months. And now, here it was. Reporters would later write that the room had a stillness like the tomb. The soldiers who stood guard never looked directly at the body. Some said a chill filled the air, despite the warm spring weather outside. Lamon didn't speak. He stood at the edge of the casket, his fists clenched. He was a man of reason, a man who had mocked spiritualists, debunked séances, and derided omens. But now, he could not explain away the prophecy that had unfolded in chilling precision. The dream, the mirror, the blood, the empty box at Ford's. And the East Room, dressed in black. The public mourning began. Throngs passed through the White House in silence, watching the casket from behind velvet ropes. Mary Lincoln, shattered, refused to leave her chambers. Tad, the youngest son, sobbed uncontrollably. "They killed my papa," he kept repeating. "They killed him." And in the center of it all stood Lamon, unmoving, watching, remembering. He thought back to the countless times he'd warned Lincoln. Not just of Booth, but of the climate. The threats. The letters. Hundreds had written to the White House with violent promises. Some, Lamon had read aloud. Others he burned. One, dated 3 months earlier, had simply said, "He dreams too much. Soon he will dream no more." It hadn't been signed. After the funeral train departed, Lamon stayed behind. He helped organize the procession, dealt with the press, and met with the cabinet. But his mind never left the East Room. It became an obsession. He began recording everything. Dreams, letters, sightings, even second-hand stories about Lincoln's final days. He compiled them in a private journal labeled Confidential, to be sealed. In it, he wrote. He knew. Long before the bullet, he had seen it. It was no mere fear, it was certainty. He was walking toward death with his eyes open. But Lamon's curiosity turned into something darker. Because as he dug deeper, he discovered whispers of a network, people who had warned Lincoln, others who claimed to have seen the same dream, even mediums who insisted they had contacted the president after his death. And the name John Wilkes Booth began to appear in some of those circles long before the assassination. Was this simply coincidence? Or had the dream been planted? Later that year, Lamon returned to the theater, alone. The box where Lincoln had been shot remained sealed. A guard stood outside. Lamon requested a brief moment inside. The man hesitated, then allowed it. The room was small. Dust coated the chairs. A fragment of Lincoln's blood-stained cloak still clung to the floorboards, missed by the cleaning crews. Lamon stood in the silence and stared at the stage, trying to imagine what the president had seen in his final moment. The play, the laughter, the flash of metal, then nothing. He turned to leave, but before he did, he reached into his coat and placed a small envelope on the floor. It contained Lincoln's last letter to him. "Be careful, the night feels too quiet." In the months following Lincoln's death, Washington was a city unmoored. The war had ended, but peace was hollow. A president had died, not on the battlefield, but in a velvet-lined theater box, beneath a chandelier. And Ward Hill Lamon found himself consumed, not just with grief, but with questions no one wanted to ask. He was not alone. Behind closed doors, in quiet drawing rooms, another kind of war had been unfolding during Lincoln's presidency. One that had little to do with bullets and battles, and everything to do with the unknown. The supernatural. They called it the spiritual cabinet. Lamon first heard the name in a letter, unsigned, written in flowing hand. "You were right to fear." But it was never just a man with a gun. The signs were given. "You must speak with L." He decoded the reference almost immediately. L was likely Nettie Colburn Lane, the young medium who had been summoned multiple times to the White House during the war. Lincoln had allowed it. That had shocked Lamon more than anything. A president, indulging séances. Mary had been obsessed, yes, but Abraham had sat in on at least 3 of them. Lamon had tried to intervene once, even mocked the practice openly. Lincoln had only smiled. "I don't say I believe," he told Lamon once. But sometimes, answers don't come from the living. Now, months later, Lamon wanted those answers. He found Nettie in Baltimore, under a false name. Her house was dark, the shutters drawn. She looked older than he remembered, haunted. At first, she refused to speak of Lincoln. Too dangerous, she said. Too many were watching. Then Lamon showed her a page from Lincoln's private journal, a line written only days before the assassination. If the veil between is as thin as it feels, perhaps the voice that calls is not imagination, but memory echoing backward. Nettie went silent. Then, slowly, she began to talk. She told him of the final séance, the one no one spoke of. It had taken place just 2 weeks before the shooting. Lincoln had been pale, shaking. He said he'd heard a knocking on his chamber wall at exactly 2:22 a.m., 3 nights in a row. Each time, he opened the door to nothing. But the knocking continued. At the séance, the medium had asked for a sign. The table rose on its own. A whisper, inaudible to most, had drifted through the air. Only Lincoln had heard it. He turned pale, stood up, and ended the session immediately. What did it say? Lamon asked. Nettie hesitated. He never repeated it, but I saw his lips move when it came. I read them. She swallowed. It's time. Lamon began to retrace Lincoln's final weeks, visits, letters, contacts. He discovered something disturbing. Multiple people close to the president reported hearing similar knocks, strange voices, or vivid dreams in the weeks leading up to April 14. Too many to be coincidence. Even Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's son, later confessed he dreamt of his father in a coffin, days before the assassination. Lamon's rational mind resisted, but the evidence mounted. Then he uncovered the most troubling letter yet. It had been sent to Mary Lincoln in early April, postmarked from New York. It simply read, "Your husband walks in 2 worlds. Before the month ends, he will choose one." Mary never told anyone about it, except a single confidant. That confidant had been Ward Hill Lamon. By the end of the year, Lamon's investigations drew unwanted attention. He was followed. Anonymous letters warned him to stop. One night, returning to his quarters, he found a note pinned to his door. It read, "You guard the dead too closely. Let the dream rest." But Lamon didn't stop. He believed the assassination had been allowed, not just by security failures or politics, but by something deeper. A network of silence, a veil of omens that had wrapped itself around the president, and pulled him into myth. And Lamon, always the protector, had arrived one step too late. Still, one question remained. Did Lincoln really know the day would come, and choose not to stop it? Spring turned to winter. Snow covered Washington in a soft white shroud, but Ward Hill Lamon saw only shadow. He had buried the man, read the dreams, traced the whispers. And still, one haunting detail refused to leave him. The crows. In the days before the assassination, multiple witnesses, including soldiers at the White House, reported seeing large black birds gathering unnaturally close to the residence. One even flew into the East Room through an open window before being chased out. It perched for hours on the north lawn fence, unmoving, staring at the building. Lincoln had noticed them, and he had commented once, quietly, "Death flies in feathers now." At the time, Lamon thought it poetic. Now he thought it might have been something else. A warning, a pattern. Because when he began researching other assassinated or nearly assassinated leaders, foreign and domestic, he found an odd recurrence. Stories of birds, large, black birds appearing in strange places just before tragedy. Rome, Paris, Richmond, even Napoleon's exiled court on Elba. Coincidence? Lamon wasn't sure, but the sightings around Lincoln were too specific, too close to be dismissed. So he dug further, and what he found took him into a darkness he hadn't expected. There existed, it seemed, a secret ledger, a collection of symbols, patterns, omens, compiled quietly by members of Lincoln's inner circle. He uncovered references to it in the personal papers of Noah Brooks, another Lincoln confidant, and in the post-war writings of a Union general named Ethan Stokes. It was called the Code of the Crows. More folklore than fact, it was a system of signs, birds, dreams, mirror images, numbers, that, when appearing in sequence, predicted the death of a public figure. Lincoln had apparently seen enough of them to believe it was real. He never admitted it publicly, but he referenced the code in a private letter to Lamon, discovered only after the latter's death. The letter read, "If I fall, do not seek vengeance. Seek the pattern. It is older than either of us. Older than war." Lamon's hands shook as he read it. Not out of fear, but recognition. The pattern had returned. Because now, it wasn't just the past speaking. He had begun to see shadows moving around his own life. Anonymous notes. Familiar faces appearing in crowds more than once. Once, in the still hours of night, Lamon claimed he awoke to knocking, at exactly 2:22 a.m. 3 raps. Silence. Then nothing. He opened the door. The corridor was empty. He would later write, "I am no believer in ghosts. But I have come to believe in echoes. And they follow me." Desperate for answers, Lamon returned to Ford's Theater, not the stage, but the basement, where old props and forgotten relics from the night of April 14th had been stored. And there, among dust and decay, he found a locked wooden box. Inside, a blood-stained theater program, Booth's hand-sketched floor plan of the presidential box, and one more item. A torn scrap of parchment, scorched at the edges, with a phrase written in Latin. Mortem videt ante oculis. He sees death before his eyes. It wasn't Booth's handwriting. Lamon wasn't even sure it was meant for him. He began compiling everything. The dreams, the signs, the birds, the notes, the whispers. He titled the manuscript, "The President's Warnings." It was never published. Historians wouldn't see it until decades later. But in its final pages, he included a single entry dated April 13, 1865, the night before the assassination. In Lincoln's own hand. "There is no tragedy in death. Only in not knowing when it is owed." And just beneath it, written in Lamon's own script, he knew. And still he went. "I was meant to stop it. But how do you stop a man who walks willingly into a prophecy?" The next day, Lincoln was dead. And Lamon had already begun to vanish from public life, his purpose hollowed by the one moment he had failed to protect. By 1870, Ward Hill Lamon had become a ghost in Washington. He no longer held office. His role as protector, as Lincoln's shadow, had ended not with a retirement, but a death he could not undo. The years passed, and the city forgot his face. But Lamon remembered everything, and he believed, truly believed, that Lincoln's assassination was not an isolated act of political violence. It was something ritualistic, a moment predicted, perhaps orchestrated. He moved to Martinsburg, West Virginia, where he lived in relative obscurity. But he never stopped writing. He filled notebook after notebook with observations, codes, recurring phrases found in obscure Civil War letters, and death dreams submitted by citizens after the war. Some of those dreams were dated before April 1865. Some described a darkened room, a veiled man in a chair, or 3 knocks on the door. Some ended with blood on a pillow. Lamon had intended to publish his findings. He considered a memoir, The Watchman's Burden, but feared public ridicule. The age of rationality was taking hold. Séances and omens were being pushed aside by progress in science. To speak of dreams and prophetic crows would be to lose all credibility. And yet, the coincidences persisted. In 1875, he received a letter from Clara Harris, who had been in the box at Ford's Theater the night Lincoln died. She, too, had seen visions afterward. Strange ones. She said she'd heard Booth whisper in her sleep. Not words, but a tune. Over and over. The president walks into the play, but leaves the dream behind. Clara would be murdered by her own husband 3 years later, another man haunted by that night. Lamon added her name to the ledger. He began to dream of Lincoln again. Not as he had been in life, but seated, motionless, in a coffin, then rising, slowly, without opening his eyes. In one dream, Lincoln looked directly at Lamon and whispered, "You did not fail me. You witnessed me." Lamon awoke in tears. And he began to believe something else, that he had not simply been Lincoln's protector. He had been the recorder. The chronicler of a myth born in real blood. A myth that had to be remembered exactly, or else it would repeat itself. Because the signs, they were returning. Not to Washington, but elsewhere. In 1880, Lamon read about an attempted attack on President Rutherford B. Hayes. The would-be assassin had written pages of nonsense, except for one coherent sentence. I saw the man in the mirror. He was pale, he was dead. Lamon circled it in red ink. Later, in 1881, President James Garfield was assassinated. And again, the signs appeared. Dreams, blackbirds, a broken mirror in the White House just days before. The pattern had returned. Lamon compiled all of it in his final, unfinished work. The Cycle of the Dream, a document historians dismissed for decades as obsessive fiction. But within it were records of conversations, letter excerpts, and predictions. One page read, "The presidency is not merely a seat of power. It is a throne of sacrifice. The one who sits upon it will either die in glory, or be buried by secrets." At the bottom of that same page, a hand-drawn crow. Wings outstretched, 3 tally marks beneath it. 3 presidents, 3 deaths. The pattern was no longer a question. It was a countdown. Lamon died in 1893. Quietly, without fanfare. His journals were boxed and stored by his family. Many would remain unopened for nearly a century. But among them was one last letter, sealed in an envelope addressed not to a name, but to the next watchman. It read, "If you are reading this, then you have seen what I have seen. The signs are not superstition. They are recurrence. What happened to him was only the first cycle. Protect the dreamer. Warn him, even if he will not listen." And then, as if echoing Lincoln himself, "The dream is not the danger. The danger is ignoring it." Epilogue. In 1963, just days before he was shot in Dallas, President John F. Kennedy told his secretary Evelyn Lincoln that he believed he would die in office. He even mentioned Lincoln by name. He'd read about the similarities. The dreams. One night, he said, he saw a dark corridor. At the end, a man was waiting. When asked what he looked like, Kennedy said, "He looked a lot like me." And somewhere, perhaps in an unopened archive, Ward Hill Lamon's warning waits for another reader. Another dreamer. Another cycle. The 20th century did not silence Ward Hill Lamon's warnings, it amplified them. With every new president, the question of fate returned, cloaked in modern language but echoing the same ancient pattern. Dreams, signs, coincidences. The cycle continued. Lamon had seen it, and others, quietly, had begun to see it too. After the death of John F. Kennedy, the nation was shaken not only by the violence, but by the eerie familiarity of it all. 2 presidents, a century apart, both struck down while in office. Both succeeded by Southern vice presidents named Johnson. Both facing intense division. Both preceded by strange, prophetic remarks. Researchers pored over the parallels. But one detail remained largely unknown. Lamon's ledger had predicted it. In his unpublished manuscripts, he'd written, "If another should rise in charisma, walk freely in crowds, smile as if untouched by fear, watch the birds. Watch the mirrors. The dreamer always draws the bullet." Kennedy had famously loved walking among the people, disliked security, trusted too easily. Just like Lincoln. But Lamon's prophecy extended further still. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan was shot by John Hinckley Jr. outside a Washington hotel. He survived, barely. Later, it was revealed that just days before the shooting, Reagan had told his wife Nancy about a bad feeling. He had dreamed of being surrounded by mourners. Nancy, who famously consulted an astrologer during Reagan's presidency, claimed to have altered his schedule based on celestial signs. Most dismissed it as superstition. But one archivist, cataloging historical correspondence for the Library of Congress, made a stunning discovery in 1992. A letter, unmarked, undated, found among the effects of a deceased Lincoln historian. It read, "The man will survive. Not because he was spared, but because the pattern must pause. 3 deaths, then a breath. The crow rests, but not forever." The signature was faded. but the handwriting matched Ward Hill Lamon. Then came 2001. President George W. Bush, in the days before September 11, told aides he had felt a sense of waiting. That something was coming. After the attacks, he often spoke of feeling protected by something unseen. A phrase eerily similar to Lincoln's own comment in 1864. I am not afraid, there is something over me. Another dream? Another watchman? In 2005, a professor of presidential history named Dr. Elise Hargrave stumbled upon a coded journal belonging to one of Lamon's grandsons. The entries were fragmented, written in both English and cipher. But the final line was unmistakable. He warned them. None listened. The crow still watches the dome. And so we come to the present. A new century, new leaders, but the pattern remains. Mirrors still crack in the White House. Visitors still report cold spots in the East Room. On certain nights, security guards claim to hear knocking, 3 soft raps, along the old wooden walls of the second floor. At exactly 2:22 a.m., most shrug it off. Coincidence, old pipes, night air. But deep in the archives, Lamon's notes are being digitized, translated, studied again. And among the thousands of pages, researchers recently found something strange. A sealed envelope, unopened for over 150 years. Its label? To whom the dream comes next. Inside, a single sheet of paper. No signature, just 12 words. If you wake in darkness, do not go to the mirror.